United States History by Joseph Jarrell, Chapter 7. The Critical Period from 1781 to 1789. The 1780s were arguably the most critical decade in Americans' history. From the War for Independence to the ratification of the Constitution, those years were characterized by conflict and change. At the start of the decade, for example, British troops patrolled the streets of New York City in the name of King George III. By the decade's end, American citizens paraded through the same streets to celebrate the inauguration of another President George Washington. Americans changed governments twice during the 1780s. They threw off British rule through success on the battlefield, but they then scrapped their national confederation because of its weaknesses and set up new form of government. Americans made their greatest contribution to political thought and practice the writing of the Constitution. The Constitution capped the independence movement, provided a stable national government through which the states were united in more than name only. The Constitution gave substance to the spirit of '76. Number 1. Government by Confederation. On June 7, 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted to draw up a charter for joining the colonies into a confederation, a close alliance of sovereign states. Congress entrusted the task to the committee headed by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, and in a little more than a month, Dickinson's committee presented its work. After more than a year of debate and revision, Congress adopted these Articles of Confederation. By 1781, all 13 states had approved the Articles and they went into effect. League of States. Dickinson originally proposed establishing a strong central government. However, the states, jealous of their power and fearing centralization, watered down his plan. The Articles of Confederation did little more than grant legitimacy to the loosely constructed Continental Congress and provide the minimum authority needed to conduct the war. Although the states pledged themselves to perpetual union, they committed themselves only to a firm league of friendship with each other. The Articles said plainly, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. In effect, the central government was only as strong as the states allow, and that was not very strong. The legislature was the only component of the Confederate government. The Congress of the Confederation was unicameral, having only one house. Each state legislature could elect 2 to 7 representatives to attend, but each state had only one vote, regardless of how many representatives it sent. Important legislation, such as declaring war, approving treaties, and coining money, had to be approved by 9 states. Amending and ratifying the Articles required the unanimous consent of all 13 states. The chief executive, the President of Congress, was chosen by the legislature and was completely under its control. He was virtually powerless, and 3 officials, the Superintendent of Finance, the Secretary of War and Foreign Affairs, handled most administrative duties. A national judiciary did not yet exist. The Articles simply formalized how the 13 states were functioning historically, politically, and economically. Therefore, the Articles reserved to the states every power, jurisdiction, and right that was not expressly delegated to Congress. Among the most important powers reserved to the states was the power to tax. Unable to levy taxes, Congress was forced to ask the states for money, a request that the states could and did ignore if they wished. The central government was reduced to scrapping funds together through loans from other nations, which the government usually could not repay. The sale of public lands on the frontier and the profits from the government-owned post offices, 10 to 15,000 a year. In its years of existence, the Confederation government barely had enough revenue to cover its expenses. Successes of the Confederation. Despite its glaring weaknesses and ultimate failure, the Confederation achieved a few successes. Chief among these were the Treaty of Paris and the settlement of the Western Land dispute. The Treaty of Paris was the Confederation's greatest triumph in foreign affairs. By forcing Great Britain to recognize American independence, the treaty built enormous prestige for the young nation. At the same time, enforcement of the treaty revealed several weaknesses in the Confederation and squandered much of the reputation that the United States had carefully built. By the provisions of the treaty, the United States was to restore the seized property of Loyalists and allow British subjects access to American courts to recover debts owed them. The American government, however, had no means of enforcing those provisions. It could only ask the states to comply. When the states refused, Britain used the breach of the treaty as an excuse to keep its forts in the Great Lakes region and thus protect the profitable British fur trade. When John Adams complained to the British about their violation of the treaty, the British pointed to the United States' failure to honor its obligations. When Adams tried to argue that the states would not allow the central government to do so, the British asked whether the United States was one nation or 13. Other governments that dealt with the young nation soon echoed this taunt. Approval of the Articles of Confederation had been delayed until 1781 because Maryland refused to ratify them until the matter of the western lands had been settled. The Treaty of Paris left the United States in control of all territory east of the Mississippi River and north of Florida and Louisiana. Several states, notably Virginia and New York, claimed parts of that huge tract of land. Several other states, including Maryland, had no such claims and feared the power of the other states if they succeeded in claiming that land. Therefore, Maryland would not ratify the Articles unless the other states abandoned their claims and turned those lands over to the federal government. When Virginia and New York agreed to yield their claims to the federal government, the others eventually followed suit, and Maryland ratified the Articles. North of the Ohio River, all lands that passed into the hands of the national government became known as the Northwest Territory. The question of how to develop and govern the Northwest Territory was settled by a series of ordinances. The first and most far-sighted was the Ordinance of 1784, written by Thomas Jefferson. He proposed creating 10 new states out of the territory, each of which would be equal to the other states in the Union. He also proposed banning slavery in the region and giving the land to settlers instead of selling it. Unfortunately, the ordinance was so far-sighted that it never went into effect. Too many states feared the creation of 10 competing states, and some states opposed the ban on slavery. The Land Ordinance of 1785 was far more cautious and avoided thorny political questions. Instead, it concentrated on the settlement of the territory. The ordinance divided the new lands into ordinary townships for sale and development. Each township contained 36 sections or lots of 1 square mile, 640 acres. Each lot was to be sold for $1 an acre, $640, contrary to Jefferson's hope for free land for settlers. The proceeds from the sale of Lot 16 in each township were to go toward building and maintaining schools in the area. More sweeping was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Whereas the Ordinance of 1785 concerned settlements, the Ordinance of 1787 concerned government. The Northwest Territory was to be divided into at least 3, but no more than 5 states. Each state went through 3 stages. In the first stage, the region remained almost completely under the direct control of the federal government. When a region had at least 5,000 free inhabitants, it entered the second stage and became a territory. The people could then elect a legislator and send a representative to Congress. However, the governor, still appointed by the national government, could veto any act passed by the territorial legislature, and the territorial representative to Congress could not vote. In the third stage, once a territory had 60,000 free inhabitants, it could draw up a state constitution and be admitted to the Union on an equal basis with the other states. Other provisions are noteworthy. Building on the educational provision in the Land Ordinance of 1785, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 explicitly emphasized the importance of education. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good and government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Most importantly, the ordinance followed Jefferson's original suggestion and prohibited slavery in the new territories. Almost most states that entered into the Union afterward followed the political process set down by the Northwest Ordinance. These ordinances were the greatest success of the Confederate government. They allowed orderly settlement of the territory, and the land sales they permitted provided income for the government. Years later, Daniel Webster said that he doubted whether one single law of any lawgiver, ancient or modern, has produced effects of more distinct, marked, and lasting character than the Ordinance of 1787. Failures of the Confederation. The new nation's financial situation was understandably dire. After a 6-year war on its soil, the weakness of the Articles did not help. The national government was almost always in debt, and the individual states were not much better off. Hard money, silver and gold, were scarce. But paper money, the obvious answer to the lack of hard money, presented its own difficulties. During the war, the national government had printed so much money, continental dollars, that paper money's value plummeted and merchants would not accept it. The expression not worth a continental came to mean that something was worthless. Compounding the problem was each state's ability to print its own currency. State currency was often as worthless as the continental notes. Many merchants required payment in hard currency or bartered trade goods. One Massachusetts newspaper editor announced that he would not accept salt pork as payment for subscriptions. Finally, the states dealt a fatal financial blow to the Congress of the Confederation. On two occasions, Congress proposed amendments to the articles that would permit Congress to levy small tariffs for revenue, as opposed to the protective tariff. In both instances, failure to attain the required unanimous vote for an amendment killed the measure. The second failure spurred efforts by those who desired a revision of the Articles or even a new constitution. It seemed nothing of lasting value could ever be accomplished under the Articles of Confederation. Foreign weakness. The separate interests of the states often hampered the national government's conduct of foreign affairs in negotiating the Treaty of Paris and in later treaty discussions. European powers such as Britain, Spain, and France learned that they could play on jealousies among the states to undercut the United States bargaining position. Financial and military weaknesses only worsened matters when the United States ran afoul of the Barbary pirates in northern Africa. The nation could not even pay the demand bribes, let alone build and arm a Navy squadron to protect American shipping. Domestic weakness. Internal weaknesses resulted in part from economic confusion. The existence of 14 different currencies verifying tariffs and a post-war depression weakened the financial fabric that could have bound a nation together. The most serious threat, however, was the national government's inability to keep the peace within its own borders. In 1783, a group of officers in Newborough, New York, grew frustrated by Congress's inability to pay salaries and pensions. The soldiers were backed by businessmen who feared the economic chaos that they saw looming before them. In this Newborough conspiracy, the officers intended to force Congress and the states to grant them their back pay. Some conspirators wanted more. They wanted to establish a new government under a king or dictator. Washington was their first choice as the leader, but if he refused, they would find someone else. Washington coldly rejected every offer to become a military ruler. When he learned that the officers planned a mass meeting in Newborough to discuss their grievances, he came as an uninvited guest. He spoke kindly to the men, sympathizing with their needs, but urging them not to destroy the nation they had fought for. At the conclusion of the speech, Washington started to reassure the men by reading the favorable letter from a congressman. Before reading it, he paused and with deliberation took out his glasses and put them on. "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles," the general said, "for I have grown not only gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." When Washington finished reading, tears filled the eyes of many of the men for reasons unrelated to the letter's contents. Before them stood the patriot who had weathered the snows of Valley Forge, faced the bullets of the British, the men whose strength of character and leadership had been the greatest weapon in American arsenal. The Newborough conspiracy collapsed, but it had threatened the young and fragile government. An even more serious problem arose in Massachusetts in 1786. Instead of simply conspiring against the government as the ringleaders at Newborough had done, a group of men actually took up arms against the government. Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolution, led an insurrection of farmers against the courts in the western part of the state. The farmers had purchased land at inflated prices. In the depression that followed, they could not meet their obligations. When many of them were jailed, they retaliated by using force to close the courts. The insurrection climaxed in a vain attempt to seize weapons from an arsenal. Shortly thereafter, the militia crashed the uprising. Shays' Rebellion was quelled only a few weeks before the delegates of the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787. The delegates, shaken by the violence, undoubtedly considered it a warning. Americans had preserved their liberty from destruction by the British after the war. They had to preserve it from destruction by themselves. The Article of Confederation looked increasingly inadequate for the task. Number 2, a new charter. The failures and weaknesses of the Confederation government caused thoughtful men to consider what could be done. Trade discussions gave them an opportunity to voice their ideas. Representatives from Virginia and Maryland met in 1785 at Alexandria, Virginia, and at George Washington's home at Mount Vernon to discuss trade disputes involving the Potomac River. The Mount Vernon meeting was so profitable that the legislatures of Maryland and Virginia called for another trade convention in Annapolis, Maryland. That would include all 13 states. The Annapolis Convention was not well attended. Only 5 state representatives. Alexander Hamilton, a delegate from New York, wrote a resolution calling for another convention to remedy the weaknesses of the Confederation government. Faced with growing discontent and fear of anarchy, the Federation Congress, which Washington described as half-starved, limping government, reluctantly seconded the idea of a convention in Philadelphia on May 1787. The Constitutional Convention. The delegates arrived for an opening session on May 25th. A cool rain offered relief from the already unbearable warm weather that had settled over the city. Old-timers agreed that if it was the hottest summer in memory. Drenched and mud-splattered, the delegates met at the Pennsylvania State House, where 11 years earlier the Declaration of Independence had been signed. Despite the wet weather, the delegates were excited. They were eager to work and enthusiastic about what could be accomplished. Virginian James Madison, whose ideas earned him the title Father of the Constitution, declared that their work would settle forever the fate of Republican government. Thomas Jefferson, overseas at the time as Minister to France, referred to the men who served in the Philadelphia Convention as an assembly of demigods, partly divine beings. It was indeed a remarkable gathering of talent. Numbered among the 55 delegates was the best political thinkers and finest lawyers in America, well-read and well-educated. Their talents, however, were not simply the product of book learning. They were practical men, of experience, many of them as skilled as the sword as with the pen. Half of them had fought in the Revolutionary War. 39 had served in the Continental or Confederation Congresses, which gave them a broad range of practical political experience. Among these men were past, present, and future governors, and 2 future United States presidents. The Constitutional Convention was more than a gathering of talent. However, it was also a collection of regional and individual interests. 12 independent states, Rhode Island refused to participate, were represented. These states, apart from wartime emergencies, had never been very neighborly. Diverse delegate interests led to heated debates and threatened the survival of the convention. That these men represented their state's interest could hardly be considered a vice, because they were elected as state representatives to the convention. However, many of them had a larger national vision of their work and were able to compromise. The first task was to elect a convention president to the chair proceedings. The delegates unanimously elected George Washington, whose very presence gave credibility to the meeting. Interestingly, 12 years earlier, in the same room in which they were meeting, Washington had been elected commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He likely found his war experience beneficial in overseeing the squabbles that soon broke out at the convention. Crucial compromises. The most important question that the convention delegates faced initially was why they were meeting. Were they there to revise the Articles in an attempt to breathe some life into the Confederation, or should they start over and draft a fresh agreement? The delegates answered the question on May 30th, acting as a resolution by Delegate Governor Morris. They agreed that a national government ought to be established, consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary. Having quickly answered the basic question, the delegates soon saw their harmony fractured over the details of how much government should be formed. The disputes grew largely out of regional interests and would require compromise on 3 major issues: representation, slavery, and trade. The Great Compromise. How the states were to be represented was the most difficult question. The battle lines were drawn between the large states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York, and the smaller states, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. James Madison had carefully considered the composition and structure of the new Congress. His thorough study of political thought, both ancient and modern, and his careful planning resulted in a proposal known as the Virginia Plan, which would become the basis for much of the Constitution. Madison's Virginia Plan, which was introduced to the convention by fellow Virginian Edmund Randolph, advocated a bicameral two-house Congress. With the number of representatives based on state population, members of the lower house of Representatives would be elected by direct popular vote. The lower house in turn would elect members of an upper house or Senate for nominee submission by state legislators. In contrast to the powerless, penniless Confederation Congress, the legislature under the Virginia Plan would have greatly expanded powers. For example, the new Congress would be able to enforce its laws on the states and would be empowered to elect both the chief executive and the national judiciary. Those two branches, the executive and judicial, would unite to veto congressional acts, but their veto could be overridden by a vote in both houses of Congress. Since representation under the Virginia Plan was based on the state population, it naturally favored the states with larger populations. The smaller states were quick to react to the proposal, setting forth a proposal of their own known as the New Jersey Plan. This smaller state plan, represented by William Paterson of New Jersey, advocated a unicameral Congress, similar to the Confederation Congress, with each state having only one vote, regardless of its population. John Dickinson, who had represented Pennsylvania in the First and Second Continental Congresses, was now living in Delaware. As a delegate from the state, he rebuked Madison, saying the New Jersey Plan was the result of Madison's stubborn refusal to change his views about representation. The convention deadlocked over the issue of representation. Dickinson conceded that some of the members from the small states wish for two branches in the general legislature and are friends to a good national government. But he told Madison, "We would sooner submit to a foreign power than submit to be deprived of an equality of suffrage in both branches of the legislature and thereby be thrown under the dominion of the larger states." The small states feared domination by the large states. The large states feared the diminishing of their power through a lack of representation, arguing that basic democratic principles favored proportional representation. In summary, the New Jersey Plan advocated each state receive one vote in Congress. The Virginia Plan advocated congressional representation based on population. The haggling went on for weeks, as hot weather and hotter debates threatened the survival of the convention. The windows were raised at times in hopes to draw a breeze, but they usually drew only unwelcome flies and fumes. Sewer construction was under way in the streets outside the State House. Irritated delegates adjusted their sweaty collars, but not their positions. Some threatened to go home. Roger Sherman of Connecticut offered the embroiled assembly a solution to its dead-end debate. Sherman was a Christian with an unwavering testimony for Christ. John Adams referred to him as the old Puritan, honest as an angel. Sherman put together a compromise that saved both the convention and the Constitution, the Great Compromise. It proposed that representation in the lower house be based on state population, whereas representation in the Senate be equal for all states regardless of size. Alexander Hamilton called it a motley measure. But Sherman's proposal was a classic example of political compromise. Both sides gave up something, both sides got something. The convention continued. The Three-Fifths Compromise. The next divisive issue that confronted the delegates of the Constitutional Convention was how to count slaves when determining representation for states. Since slavery was practiced in all the original 13 states, this was not yet a fully developed North-South or slave state versus free state issue. However, slavery was quickly being abolished in northern states, and southern states had a growing slave population. Therefore, a formula for counting slaves for purposes of representation was important to all. To settle the issue of how slaves should be counted, delegates established the Three-Fifths Compromise. Under this settlement, 3/5 of the total slave population of a state would be included for representation purposes in the House, but those states would have to pay taxes on the slave population at the same rate. It is significant to note that the wording of the Constitution recognizes slaves as persons rather than property. This wording established an important precedent. The compromise also sought to maintain a balance between states with a small slave population and states with a large slave population, but it did not resolve the growing debate about slavery. Many delegates were opposed to slavery, but the issue was a thorny political question. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut reminded his fellow delegates that the morality or wisdom of slavery are considerations belonging to the states themselves. The states are the best judge for their particular interest, George Mason of Virginia countered. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. Yet it would be left to the children and grandchildren of the constitutional farmers to resolve the slave question. Part of the motivation behind calling the Philadelphia Convention was the failure of the Confederation to resolve interstate trade disputes and direct international trade. Although most delegates agreed that Congress needed a role in commerce, regional interests kept them at odds over the extent of that role. Southern states in particular were concerned that the new Congress would ban the slave trade and raise revenue through export duties. Such duties would hurt the economies of those states, which were dependent on the export of raw goods. A compromise settled the issue. By the terms of the agreement, Congress was given power over foreign and interstate commerce. However, the legislature was forbidden to impose any export taxes on the states, and Article 5 of the Constitution preventing making any amendments regarding the slave trade until 1808. Despite disputes over details, the constitutional farmers agreed on certain basic principles. These principles have given the Constitution and the government its outline durability. Many of the constitutional principles grew out of the founders' understanding of human nature. They recognized the people, both the governed and the governors, are inherently sinful. As John Adams, quoting Machiavelli, pointed out, whoever would found a state and make proper laws for the government of it must presume that all men are bad by nature. This is not to say that the Constitution is a Christian document any more than its farmers were all Christians. Some were moral men, some were God-fearing men, and some were neither. But what is clear is that the Constitution was written in a society where biblical principles were pervasive, and the document can be best understood in the light of those principles. These principles are not spelled out in a document itself, but they contribute to its fabric. The key principles of the Constitution center on the issue of power, how to divide, balance, limit, and allot governmental power in view of human corruption. James Madison underscored this point in The Federalist when he wrote, "What is government itself, but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary." In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. Striking a balance between liberty and order was the great challenge and triumph of the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution established a republic, a government run by representatives chosen by the accountable to the voters. The founders opposed a monarchy or an aristocracy, but also opposed a democracy, which they feared would dissolve into rule by the mob. This republican philosophy was part of the founders' thinking when they decided how various government officials would be elected. The president by the Electoral College, which, through its electors, represents the people for the entire nation. The House members by popular vote to represent specific local districts, and the senators by state legislators to represent state government. The underlying theme of the Constitution is limited government. The nation had only recently shaken off British tyranny through a bloody war, so the Philadelphia delegates fully understood the consequences of unlimited government, the very definition of tyranny. The principle of limited government is expressed by the nature of a written constitution, the first and oldest in continuous use. Unlike the unwritten British Constitution, an open-ended accumulation of laws and traditions subject to parliamentary action, the American Constitution, as a written character, clearly defined the limiting of governmental power and broadened the scope of the individual liberty. The principles of separation of powers and checks and balances also contributed to the limitations on governmental power. To prevent any group or individual from gaining too much power, the founders designed the national government with the separation of powers in mind. That is the division of the government into three separate branches: the legislative branch, Article 1 of the Constitution, the executive branch, Article 2, and the judicial branch, Article 3. In broad terms, under the Constitution, Congress makes the laws, the President executes and enforces the laws, and the courts interpret the laws. Although the three branches are separate, they are not fully independent. Their responsibilities interests intersect in many areas, and a certain amount of cooperation is necessary to make the national government work effectively. Although separation of powers is often thought to be synonymous with checks and balances, there's an important difference. If power were only divided, then one branch could expand its power within its rightful sphere and come to dominate the other branches. The principle of checks and balances is designed to thwart such an accumulation of power by establishing a balance of power among the three branches. For example, Congress passes a bill to become a law. The President may reject or veto the bill. However, his veto may be overridden by a two-thirds vote in both House and Congress. For its part, the Supreme Court may nullify acts of both Congress and the President if a majority of justices interprets a law as unconstitutional. Federalism is the division of power between national and state levels in the government. The federal system was a product of American historical and political realities. 13 separate sovereign states with differing political and social backgrounds had emerged from the colonial and early national periods. These fiercely independent states had no intention of giving up their political power. The delegates, though representing states' regional interests, also recognized the need for the strength and order of national unity. The federal system struck a crucial balance between state and national demands. Today, federalism provides needed flexibility in a large country of varying regions by giving citizens a greater voice in their affairs at the state and local level. Many people believe that the genius of the Constitution is the ambiguity. Supporters of both limited government and a strong central government can ultimately accept it. The perpetual tension that exists between these two views actually strengthens and safeguards freedoms. Popular sovereignty. The idea that the ultimate source of government power lies in the people is a constitutional principle that is evident in several areas of the Constitution. The preamble, which introduces the charter with a full flourishing sentence, reads, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Despite the dramatic "we the people," the Constitution was actually formed by the agreement of states, not individuals, and its approval was subject to state conventions, not a national referendum. The principle of popular sovereignty is best expressed in the Constitution through the document's provision for representation and amendment. Representation allows the people to have a voice in their Republican government through their elected officials. The constitutional framers, partly because they feared the fickleness of public opinion, limited the directness of the people's voice on the national level by providing direct election only for the House of Representatives. The President and the Senators, by contrast, were elected indirectly by the people. Senators, for example, were initially elected by their representative state legislators rather than by a direct vote from the constituents. Likewise, the President is elected through the indirect means of the Electoral College. Under this constitutional provision, Article 2, Section 1, each state has a number of electors equal to the state's representation in Congress. In general, all the electoral votes from a state go to the presidential candidate who receives the highest number of popular votes from that state. Constitutional amendments, changes to the Constitution, are also an expression of the people's sovereignty. Amendments that survive the difficult ratification process often reflect widespread popular support, and they always take precedence over the laws of Congress. The actions of the President and the rulings of the court. Chief Justice John Marshall stated, "The people made the Constitution. The people can unmake it. It is the creature of their will, and lives only by their will. We the people" is an enduring declaration not only the people's power to rule themselves, but also of the people's responsibility for that rule. Self-government is no easy task. It does not occur by accident, nor is it a self-propelled machine. The members of each generation must grapple with their government, use its principles, and cherish its freedoms to make it work for their day and the next. Number 3, the struggle for ratification. On September 17, 1787, Washington offered the final draft of the new charter of the convention. After the delegates signed and sent it to the Confederation Congress, the document would pass to the states for their consent or ratification. Although many of the delegates supported the final document, Edmund Randolph and George Mason of Virginia and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts objected to the expanded power of the national government and the absence of the Bill of Rights. Mason adamantly declared that he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution, because of the document's failure to agree civil liberties. Such objections foreshadowed a difficult ratification process that ultimately proved successful. The approval of at least 9 states was required by Article 12 of the Constitution. After the signing and celebration supper, the delegates parted company. Their work would now be scrutinized by the nation. The greatest hurdles lay before them. The Constitution makers had put forth a remarkable effort, but privately some of them worried about ratifications because the stakes were so high. Washington wrote Randolph saying, "This, or a dissolution of the Union, awaits our choice." He also wrote his fellow delegates, advising them that the event is in the hand of God. 2 days after the delegates went home, the text of the Constitution was published in the Pennsylvania Packet of Philadelphia. For the first time, Americans learned what they had been devised behind closed doors of the Pennsylvania State House. Not everyone was pleased. The battle lines were drawn between supporters of the Constitution, called Federalists, and those who opposed it, the Anti-Federalists. Just 1 week after the proposed Constitution was published, a New York newspaper denounced the Constitution in an article penned under the pseudonym Cato. Cato was, in fact, New York Governor George Clinton. He was soon joined by Sidney, Brutus, and others in a series of anti-Federalist articles. Alexander Hamilton, the lone New York delegate who had supported and signed the Constitution, returned home to find the political winds blowing against the Constitution. He responded to the anti-Federalist articles by writing some Federalist article under the pen name Publius. Hamilton also enlisted the help of James Madison and John Jay in a war of words. Together, the trio wrote 85 essays that were widely read throughout the country. The essays were compiled and published in 2 volumes in May of 1788 under the title The Federalists. The Federalist Papers. This work answered anti-Federalist objections by carefully explaining and forcefully defending constitutional provisions of power. It also predicted dangers and dismemberment for the nation if the Constitution were rejected. The Federalist was to ratification what common sense had been to the Revolution. It was pervasive force, particularly in those states where ratification hung in the balance. But the Federalist is also a comprehensive commentary on Republican government. Jefferson praised it as the best commentary on the principles of government which had ever been written. Historian Clinton Rossiter perhaps best explained the universality of the Federalist when he wrote that the essays are now valued not merely as clever defense of a particular charter, but as an exposition of certain timeless truths about constitutional government. The message of the Federalist reads, "No happiness without liberty, no liberty without self-government, no self-government without constitutionalism, no constitutionalism without morality, and none of these great goods without stability and order." Less well known are the Anti-Federalist Papers, the collected writings and speeches by opponents to the new Constitution. They were the response of the Anti-Federalists to the publications of the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were not radicals who were against free government and constitutional liberties. The Anti-Federalists included patriots such as Patrick Henry, Edmund Randolph, James Monroe, George Mason, George Clinton, and William Paterson. In addition to Cato, Sidney, and Brutus, the Anti-Federalists wrote under pseudonyms such as Sentinel and Federal Farmer. Delaware led the states by giving the Constitution its unanimous consent on December 7th of 1787. Within a month, four more states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut, ratified the Constitution. The toughest battles, however, were in Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, where the Anti Federalists were better organized and had leaders of considerable stature among their ranks. Massachusetts approved the Constitution in a close vote in February of 1788, and the Federalists gained the support of John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Three more states, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire, joined the six ratifying states to make the nine necessary for the Constitution to become law. The letter of the law, however, was not enough. Particularly speaking, any hopes for a national union had to include both Virginia, which was the largest state, and New York. If New York failed to ratify, then New England would be cut off geographically from the rest of the country. If Virginia refused to join, then the South would be severed. The Anti-Federalists of Virginia were led by the fiery orator Patrick Henry, and non-signing Constitutional Convention delegates George Mason and Governor Edmund Randolph. The objections of this Anti-Federalist trio represented legitimate concerns: fear of consolidated political power in an overarching national government, and the absence of guarantees of personal liberty in the Bill of Rights. The Federalists were not opposed to personal liberty; rather, most of them thought that the Bill of Rights was unnecessary, or even that it was too restrictive to limit rights to a written list. The Federalists also feared that the attempt to compose a Bill of Rights before ratification would derail both the Constitution and the necessary precondition for such freedoms: national order. After James Madison promised to introduce amendments for a Bill of Rights in the first session of Congress, the Virginia Federalists won a narrow victory for ratification 89 to 79. Madison's concession was the tiebreaker in Virginia and a catalyst for the final great state battle raging in New York. The Governor Clinton and his Anti-Federalists commanded a divisive majority against backers of the Constitution led by Alexander Hamilton. However, news of the Anti-Federalists' collapse in Virginia struck a fatal blow to Clinton's edge. By a slim margin of 30 to 27, New York ratified. North Carolina and Rhode Island held out for some time, but plans for the new government proceeded. Elections for a new Congress were set, and the opening session was scheduled for March 4, 1789, at the temporary national capital, New York City. Benjamin Franklin wrote with satisfaction, "Our new Constitution is now established, and has an appearance that promises permanency. But in a world nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." The office of Chief Executive was one of the most significant and least controversial departures from the old Confederation government. George Washington, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, was the natural choice for the nation's highest office. On February 4, 1789, Washington was unanimously elected president by the Electoral College. His old Massachusetts ally John Adams was elected as his first vice president. Washington's triumphal journey from Mount Vernon to New York City for his inauguration was a swirl of speeches, suppers, and small-town serenades. The road to New York was lined with parents hoisting their puzzled children for a glimpse of a great man, and thousands of other onlookers reaching out to touch the hero. The modest Washington was taken aback by his welcome, and privately admitted that he felt more like a culprit who is going to his place of execution. He also felt the weight of responsibility growing as he approached his inauguration. On April 30, 1789, on the balcony of New York's Federal Hall on Wall Street, the great Virginian placed his hand on the Bible and promised to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. With that, President Washington kissed the Bible. The city erupted with cheers, bells, and cannons. Washington's inauguration marked both an end and a beginning. It was the end of the long struggle for liberty and self-government. It was a national beginning. While the delegates were signing the Constitution, Madison recorded that Dr. Franklin, looking towards the president's chair, at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from the setting sun. "I have," said he, often during the course of the session, looked at that behind the president, without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is rising, and not a setting sun."